Now, we are going to venture into a little bit more kind of predictive area. And with this, I would like to introduce my next speaker, Éireann. He is Scottish, British, Englishman who's here. I met him first time online and then in person at the first conference in Japan, in Fukuoka, where we participated together in a CTF competition. With this, go ahead. The audience is yours.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I don't usually say much about myself, but I will a little. My mom's American, my dad's Scots and Welsh. I was raised partly in America. I live in England now. So hence the confused accent, basically. I'm going to apologize as well. I'm getting over bronchitis, so my voice might go partway through the presentation. I might cough for a moment or two, or have to drink some water. It's not just because I'm a heavy drinker that I've poured these 2 glasses of water. It's so I can keep speaking to you. But my goal is to make vulnerability management boring. Don't worry, I'm not trying to make the presentation boring. I mean, the business of vulnerability management should become a little bit more boring. I think at the moment, vulnerability management is like reactionary. You know, vulnerability comes out, you have protesters out front of your house talking about the vulnerability that you just found. I'm kidding. But within a business, you have a lot of people who are suddenly worried about whether or not they're going to patch this vulnerability. Does it exist in our infrastructure? How serious it is? And you have all these arguments. And so what I mean is vulnerability management is currently reactionary because it's all triggered by the vulnerability arriving in the world or being published. And that could be really frustrating. Like, I don't know if any of you heard the previous podcast, but Lorenzo and Miko and I were talking about our experience as vulnerability hunters when we were younger, finding vulnerabilities, and it often takes 6 months to get these things fixed in coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So the thing that's always bothered me is how come we wait to do anything until we hear that a vulnerability comes out? Can we get more predictive? Can we get less reactive? And I won't read the slides. You're an intelligent audience, unless you were out drinking last night. But you should be able to recognize this as a story that happens in your organization or any organization. And this repetition, I think, is legitimate. It needs to be systematized. It needs to be a process. But it shouldn't just happen as soon as the vulnerability comes out. So I'm going to talk to you about a bunch of different research over the course of the next 30 minutes that is happening. Some of it's mine, but some of it belongs to other people. And my goal is to really show you that things are changing. There's a new science of vulnerability forecasting, prediction, exploit prediction that is making things easier for us to do our jobs. And I'm excited by that research, even if I hope that eventually vulnerability management becomes more boring because of it. So why is it so stressful when a vulnerability comes out? And I think it's because it's time compressed. You know, you have to very quickly estimate how much the value of the assets are or how serious this vulnerability is based on the vulnerability researchers report and the vendors report, and they don't always match. And you spend hours like Googling the discourse between them or trying to figure out why it was embargoed or it wasn't embargoed. And then, you know, the main questions here are always the same. Is it important to us? How does this one compare to the others I should be patching? Because we might decide that this individual vulnerability is super important for whatever reason. Either it's because, you know, it's an asset that earns our company or our country billions of dollars, or maybe it's just because the vulnerability is so bad. And you know, we should get a bit more scientific about that. But that's usually what drives the stress of all this. So my point being, you know, how can we improve this? How can things get better? So I'm going to diverge for a moment and give you a little bit of history. I know it's not usually what we do in the cyber shock track, but bear with me for a minute. Weather used to be unpredictable as well. You know, we've all read stories of how battles changed because an eclipse happened, or because a hurricane occurred, or you know, destroyed all the ships in a naval battle. So weather used to be this unpredictable thing that would wreak havoc on society. In other words, it was a big risk, and it was a risk because it was unpredictable. Almanacs eventually came out where people would report the temperature, the sunshine, the rain at particular points of time throughout the seasons. And then we got a bit better at saying, okay, well, if it's September, the temperature will probably be this. If it's December, the temperature will be that. And almanacs allowed you to look at last year's weather and say next year's weather is probably going to be a bit similar. And then we got more serious. We got to the point where we have meteorology departments, and they're driving computer science, and they're making million-dollar models to predict what the next 2 weeks of weather is like. And that became like a bar for forecasting, right? If you can't forecast 6 months in advance what the weather is, you can still look at the almanac to see what it was like. So it's like a trade-off strategy, okay? So my point being, why can't vulnerabilities be more like this, okay? I'm prone to vanity, like anyone, so I name silly concepts after myself in the hope that they'll stick and be memorable. But the point is, every time I go to an organization to talk about when something should be patched, the discussion always revolves around how important it is, and then they decide not to patch it because it's so important. And this goes in a silly cycle for days or weeks or months. And my point is, if this asset is so important to you, why haven't you practiced patching it over and over and over again until you can do it easily and make all the decisions quickly? Because it is so important to you, it needs to be patched faster, not discussed more, right? Okay, another strong opinion I have, alerts. I think most of us have alert fatigue if we've been in the industry a few years. I know I certainly do. I find alerts really exhausting. And it's like a de facto way that we do business in this industry. Like, I will alert you that a vulnerability is going to come out, and then it's your problem. And I hate that. I want to get predictive. I want to get scientific. I want to have a theory. I want to forecast something. And I'll show you those forecasts in a moment. But this paper really influenced me many years ago, and it was about how the information security industry will one day belong to the quants. And maybe it's true and maybe it's not, but it's an intelligent paper. Dan Geer's a smart guy, and he really pushed this idea that we should be driving a science of security, right? We should be studying things. We should have evidence-based policy, not just strong opinions as consultants. And I think we're getting there, right? So again, a little more history. Anyone heard of Pierre-Simon Laplace? You weren't expecting a quiz, I guess. No? Okay, well, he was a mathematician and an engineer. He made contributions to engineering, to tidal formations. He'd predict, the spherical nature of the Earth, and the water on the Earth would have these tides with the moon. Did wonderful mathematics around all of that. Obviously, a lot of mathematics around probability. He did statistics. He even, to some degree, figured out that light would bend because of gravity. He almost predicted black holes, right? And he was obsessed with this idea that's known as Laplace's demon, that if you knew the position of every atom in the universe and you knew how fast they were moving, you could predict the total future of the universe. And he was sort of afraid of this. It was like the death of free will, that this demon could exist and predict everything that would ever happen in the universe. And the reason I bring this slide up is because our profession has nothing to do with that. Nothing in our profession seems predictable. And I hate that. It bothers me. It keeps me up at night. So I'm going to speak to you again a little bit about risk tolerances and finally get into some of the cyber. So if the history part was boring you, here we go. This idea is kind of so radical, I had to sketch it out on a napkin and animate it for you to get the point across. But I work in insurance now for my sins. I spent many years as an ethical hacker and then doing incident response. And to punish me for that, eventually I became a CTO. And so I have to talk about risk, and we have to talk about risk tolerance. So what I want to show you here is, what if you had an oracle that told you what the chance of exploitation of a particular vulnerability would be? We all dream of that. We all argue that the maths is wrong, but we dream of it existing. And then on the bottom, you have this idea of time. So like the things that were highest chance, I'll move on a little bit. So you have things that you patch in a day, things you patch in a week, things you patch in a month. I also like to think of patching of last resort. So like if you're in an OT network, the answer is never. That's why we call them forever days. But if you're like in a cloud environment, you spin down a VM and you spin up a new one, and some of the things have been patched for you. So that's what I think of as patching of last resort. So there's like a natural refresh rate of technology that takes vulnerabilities off the table. But it's somewhere out here, right? 2 years, 5 years, whatever. Okay, so imagine on this side, you have the chance of exploitation, okay? Now you need to start to talk about a risk tolerance for patching. How quickly do we patch things that have 100% chance of exploitation? How quickly do we patch things that have a 50% chance of exploitation or a 10% chance of exploitation? And I think that's like an important concept for us to get right, is like, what is our target rate for patching? I hear people talk about patch cadence. I hate averages because I'm kind of a quant and a maths guy. It's a thing. But the point I want to make is this. Imagine you knew the exact date you were going to get exploited by any particular vulnerability. Laplace's daemon shows up and tells you, these are the days you will be exploited with this CVE and this CVE. You'd patch like the day before or the week before, right? And you'd be perfect. You'd be perfect at defending yourself, but your patch cadence would look terrible because 90% of vulnerabilities you would never patch because you don't need to, because you know you're not going to be exploited by them. And that's why I don't like patch cadences, and that's why I like this kind of approach. So imagine, I graph this, by the way. I graph this stuff for individual companies. And like, I mark out like when they patch certain vulnerabilities based on the chance of exploitation. And I get this nice array. So this is your patch tolerance. This is like, I can't get better than this unless I spend more money and I don't have enough budget. And up here is like not important enough for me to care about. Okay, how do we get from where we are to this world? Laplace's daemon, right? Patch cadences. So I'm not interested in your average patch time. I'm interested in whether or not you're patching things in order of their importance. So we have something like 200,000 vulnerabilities in the world currently, and they're growing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Anybody have some idea of what percentage of those get exploited? Or that we have evidence of exploits being solid, engineered, and written? No? No idea? Really? 15? Good guess. Lower? 4%? Below 5%, right? So a lot of vulnerabilities just don't matter. It's almost like a bunch of people not patching stuff are rational, and the rest of us are trying to figure it out, right? From a risk point of view, right? Okay, who's heard of EPSS? This is not my work, this is other people's work, right? I'll brag about my own work later, but right now I'm going to start with somebody else's work. EPSS, good? A couple of people have heard of it, good? And like, we might have some...
I was getting a question about, like, should this be considered in your, like, analysis as well?
Exactly. All right,
If
well...
it's an RCE, 1%, still patch it.
Right.
ASAP.
Yeah, I mean, you know, yeah. But I have a lot of things to patch, right? So like, there's a workload that I have to go through, and there's a throughput.
Prioritize it. Like CVE, and like, let's say it's an RCE, then obviously it's going to be somewhere at the top.
Yeah, yeah. So the point is prioritizing everything, right? Okay, so I was around when this was created. I'm friends with one of the creators, Jay Jacobs. I'll see him at our vulnerability forecasting conference, which is happening tomorrow in Utrecht. So leave here, go there. I'm just kidding. Stay here. This is awesome. But I have to go there. And he worked on EPSS for a while, and it's published at first.org for free. So there's an API. You send in a CVE and a particular date if you want to go historical, and you get back the chance of exploitation according to the models that they have built. And if you want to go and challenge the models, that's fine too, but there are other models being built in a similar style. So we're getting to the point where we can discuss the chance of exploitation. And we can be specific. They're saying the chance of this being exploited anywhere in the world in 30 days. Not your chance of being exploited, the chance of this being exploited somewhere in the world based on the vendor, based on the type of vulnerability, and a bunch of other details. And how does this compare to CVSS? This is what we used to do. We used to say below CVSS 7, you know, we won't worry about it. Above 7, we'll patch it. But you can see there's a bunch of vulnerabilities that have a very high chance of exploitation, but they don't have a CVSS score that's very high. And any of us who've been on the red team know why. I chained together a privilege escalation that's probably like a CVSS 3 with you know, authentication bypass that might be a higher CVSS. So it makes sense that some things are low CVSS, but still highly likely to be exploited. So using this system is moving us in a science of understanding exploitation. Okay, so moving from their work to mine. I've been writing vulnerability forecasts for first.org on the blog for about a year now. I've been doing this vulnerability forecasting work for 5 years. When I first started it, I went to Airbus Research, amazing organization, and they said to me, you should choose a project, you can spend 6 months to a year on it, and it should have like a chance of failing, maybe a 30% chance of failing, because if you're not trying something that might fail, maybe you're not stretching yourself hard enough. And I thought, okay, I'm finally going to get around to this vulnerability forecasting stuff. Can I forecast vulnerabilities at all? And the end of that project, I had a wonderful helper, Matilda Rode. She's also a co-founder of the conference, and we wrote a paper together. We both work at different locations, but we open sourced some of the code together. And we still believe in the idea. Whether you use our code or not, the idea is what's important in this conference and in this topic today. So this is a vulnerability forecast for a year in advance, right? By the end of a calendar year, what will the number of vulnerabilities be? And over the last 5 years, I've been checking this stuff. So we are plus or minus 8% of the total number of vulnerabilities that will come out from NVD a year later. We can do quarterly forecasts too. Ironically, they're a little less accurate. There's a little bit more variance in there. But I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. So a year in advance, we can say you're going to have 32,000 something vulnerabilities come out from NVD. That allows patching teams to stop and think about how much they have to process. Obviously, not all of these vulnerabilities are going to be in the equipment that you have, but it gives you an idea. All right, so Matilda and I realized that the forecasting engine can actually be stepped up. So you can forecast 2 steps. This is a 2-step forecast. So the first forecast is here, and then this forecast use the previous forecast to go 1 more year, okay? And this is the first year that I've been allowed to check the accuracy of a 2-year forecast, a 2-step forecast. And it was within 9% instead of 8%. So my best guess at this moment is that we can kind of reach out even further if you want, losing about 1%, 2% per year. We'll see how that goes in the future. But that means I can actually give you a 10-year forecast of the number of vulnerabilities that are going to come out. Okay, it's a good first start. Well done. It's worth drinking and talking about, but can we do better, right? So we started talking about whether or not it was worth looking at the individual CNAs. So there was a debate inside the vulnerability forecasting community. Does the number of CNAs increase the number of vulnerabilities that are published? And we saw that it correlated, but it was a bad predictor. And that's because, like, if you think of this like a river, like the CNAs, you know, the CVE numbering authorities, they're like tributaries to NVD. They're like little rivers that contribute. And some of those rivers are small and some of them are big. So the number of them is not important. What's important is the flow rate for each of them. So I decided, let's just go down to the individual assigners and the individual CNAs. Can we forecast these individual CNAs? And the basic answer is, as long as they're big enough, as long as they have a couple vulnerabilities under their belt, a couple hundred, 200 vulnerabilities or so, and they've existed for 3 years, that's when they start to become more forecastable. So this is a forecast for F5. And you can see the number of vulnerabilities that they're likely to publish in the next 2 years as an individual organization. Now, not all CNAs are vendors. Some of them are bug bounty programs, right? And that might not give you any information about the types of vulnerabilities, particularly because they have a diverse array of them. But sometimes, with the vendors, you get these different forecasts. These are the uncertainty bars. I'm a big fan of uncertainty bars. So this is how wildly wrong I can be. And when you go down to this level of CNAs and tributaries, the uncertainty bars widen a little bit because of the statistics. But I still think it's useful. Like, if you're a patch manager who runs VMware stuff, you can say, like, I'm expecting between 140 and, 60 vulnerabilities. By the way, this is a 95% confidence interval, which means basically it will be outside this boundary 1 out of 20 forecasts. It's not bad. Pretty accurate. And this is what we expect, and it'll be some sort of way into this range. So we can do forecasts for individual vendors. Okay. Sometimes those uncertainty boundaries are really tight. And I saw this, and I was like, this has got to be a mistake. Something's wrong. Where did my uncertainty bars go? And then I published the individual forecasts. This is what it's like when I look at them. I'm sure everybody here enjoys looking at CSVs. Over and over. I don't. But I have to look at 460 of these things to vet my own work, right? And I have to do it every quarter, and then again at the end of every year to see how well we did and improve all of the science behind this. Okay. So the gist of it was, I realized that these confidence intervals, this is the lower confidence interval, this is the upper one, they're basically the same as the forecast, which means for some vendors, we can be really confident about the numbers. Or some, in this particular case, well, vendors, yeah. We can look at Apache, right? We can see roughly the number of Apache vulnerabilities that you might deal with. But it still is, in a way, it's not enough information, right? Just because it's Apache, again, doesn't mean it's likely to be exploited. It doesn't give me any CVSS score. It doesn't give me any CVSS vectors. So could we do something with those vectors? Could we start to figure out a little bit more? This is Microsoft, in case this is useful. And like I say, these are yearly forecasts, but I also do quarterly. I got a bit of applause in the middle. That's never happened to me. I sort of don't know what to do now. Anyways, quite helpful, I think. So if you're part of the patching team, could you use this in your yearly planning is basically where I'm going. And can I do more for you? Or can anybody do more for you? Like the vulnerability forecasting conference is 2 years old. It went from 25 people last year to 50 people this year. I hope it'll grow to another 50. I don't want it to be huge. I just want a small community of people who care about this stuff. And I don't really care if you want to forecast vulnerabilities, or you want to predict exploitation, or you want to predict the growth of software, or CPE strings. But if you basically want to nerd out on any of those topics and get scientific, that's what we're trying to do as a community. And then another dialogue that I'm trying to open up with anyone in this room is how can we make this more useful to you in your vulnerability management teams? Are we missing a trick? Do you do business in a certain way that this isn't helpful to you, but something else might be? So that's when we started looking into a few other things. So vectors. Everyone here sits around at night looking at CVSS scores and vectors, right? I mean, I do. Cambridge is a small town. There's not much to do in the evening. So looking at 640 vector strings is pretty exciting. Yeah. But it is useful. So we'll come back to it. I used to think that the chance of a vulnerability being, let's say, network accessible or local, and it being unauthenticated, like any of these individual components of a CVSS vector string would be independent. And most of them would be equally likely. But when you start to look at the data, guess what? Particularly with all the bug bounty programs that are coming out, it turns out that unauthenticated remote is slightly more popular than other types of vulnerabilities. I don't know why. Maybe it's because we pay for those vulnerabilities or something, but for some reason they are wildly more popular than the others, right? So for those of you who haven't really dug into this stuff, you know the CVSS numbers, and there are different versions of CVS over time, and it's changed, and when I look at the data, I have to take that into account. But these numbers are actually part of these vector strings. And they're distributed sort of normally because of the maths behind it. So these vector strings turn out to be really stable. Some of them happen far more often than others. Some of them are represented thousands and thousands of times. Some of them are represented a couple hundred times. So even though there's like 640 of them to get your head around, there's a lot to work with. And then the newer versions of CVSS3, I don't have as much history. And so the variance is a little higher, which means the uncertainty is higher, so I'm worse at predicting those. But it turns out with the CVSS 2.3 strings, I can be reasonably accurate. So what does that mean? It means I can start to get my head around this, and I can take a forecast that I have, and I can multiply it matrix style against the vector proportions, and I can come out and tell you, out of this number of vulnerabilities I'm expecting to occur, these are the vector strings that I expect them to have. And I would hope that a patch management team that has no idea what a vulnerability is going to be, but still might have some idea of whether the CVSS vector string matters to them, could start to work on this stuff. Now I realize in this presentation I forgot to mention another group that's doing great work at CISA. It's the SSVC program. And they've created like a decision tree to help you decide whether or not to patch. And you put your own information into it, you make your own decisions. But it's a way of recording your decisions, and you get a decision string that comes out of it. And that means you could revisit your decision at a later time because now we know that an exploit exists for this. And you can compare your new risk-based decision against your old risk-based decision just around a single vulnerability. And I think that's really exciting, and these vector strings are also useful there. So what I'm trying to do here is not just talk about my own research, but paint you a picture that there's a bunch of great science and decision management and risk analysis going into the vulnerability and exploitation space. And that should get very useful in the next 5 to 6 years. Probably even the next 2 to 3 years. But I'll let you be the judge of that. So I remember when I first started some of this research, I'm old enough that I use Heartbleed as an example, but I felt like I had to update things for you, awesome, younger, talented people. So I looked up this vulnerability and thought, okay, this is one of the serious ones recently. And it was a use after free. It was in Windows 10, and it came out on this date. And that must seem entirely unpredictable. But the point I want to make is that the proportion of vulnerabilities in Windows 10 is, again, relatively stable. And it's worth saying that I think Microsoft did the whole Patch Tuesday thing to become more predictable, to make it easier for you to patch their stuff. And any vendor of a certain size and responsibility is probably going to do the same. They're going to try and make it more predictable for you to patch and less likely to break everything that's going on. And I think that's good. Again, use after free, relatively common, probably because it's popular in vulnerability bug bounty programs. But also, there's a fashion in vulnerability exploitation. You know, XSS comes out, everyone does that. Remember when SQL injection came out, everybody did that for a while. Heap exploitation, that was really, you know, a thing for a period of time. And then, you know, format string vulnerabilities, equally similar. So I think we go through these periods of popularity with certain types of vulnerabilities, and that's a little bit variable. This stuff, not so much, because the most popular software in use on the internet tends to get exploited more, and people tend to find vulnerabilities in it because it promotes their career. Now, a vulnerability coming out on this individual date, highly unpredictable, right? I don't know. What I want to convince you is that each of these things is kind of proportional, right? Okay, that's one date. There might be 200, 300 vulnerabilities that came out that day over the number of total vulnerabilities. But these CPE strings as well, what's the number of Windows 10 vulnerabilities over all vulnerabilities? What's the number of CWE 416 vulnerabilities over all vulnerabilities? This stuff is becoming more predictable because we have 25 years of data. So it's worth saying for a minute that those 25 years of data were built up because previous hackers thought it was a good idea to record this stuff. And we do have some problems in the NVD program and MITRE. NVD is not the only database that exists. There's a Chinese database, CNNVD. There's the Japan vulnerability notes. I like that database as well. If you like some of this work, take the same code and try and forecast off of the JVN. There's no reason it can't be done. You just need to rework things to work with the new data format, right? So I'd love to see this work being extended to different databases. But hopefully you get the basic idea. This is a conditional probability. You've got to be a little bit good at the mathematics, but once you do that, it's just a conditional probability. It's not completely unpredictable, which means your patch management teams could be simulating some of this stuff and thinking about it before it happens. What's the chance we have a memory corruption bug in our favorite cryptography libraries? Is a question that you could have asked based on the statistics even before it occurred. All right. So if all of those things are kind of resolved, you really have to manage your inventory. You got to pay attention to what CPE strings you have. You got to pay attention to what, and this is the part that's boring. So I won't labor it. The point is, you need to know what you have, and you need to know how much it would cost you if it's exploited, right? So I stole this pretty graph from another project that I do with Lorenzo on ransomware, but you know, these are box plots. This is the variance of the cost of ransoms based on an individual ransom. So if you know your assets and you know how much it might cost you, or even if you know how much it earns you, I feel like you can get serious about the risk management behind some of these things, and you can start to use some of these predictive techniques on vulnerabilities and exploits. Like I said, EPSS is looking at the probability of a particular vulnerability having an exploit written, if you like, right? Other people I know are looking at the chance that a vulnerability exists in a network that they scan. Like if I didn't see it last month, how likely am I to see it this month? We're getting to the point where you might not have to do the vulnerability scans because you're predicting where the vulnerabilities might emerge. Or you can even try and predict, you know, which business is most likely to be hit by ransomware gangs this year. I don't do any of that stuff, but it's possible. We're getting to the point where it's possible to be more predictive. And I hope that means we do better risk management. So, all right, a little bit of an ideological position for a minute, but I think that vulnerability forecasting, some of it, should be open source. I do keep some code that I use in a proprietary manner, but the reason that I have a conference on the topic is so young, talented people can come there and do some of this stuff and make it open source. And I, too, have done that. So this is the code that I wrote with Matilda. We wrote it once for Airbus, and then we realized it could be better and faster and be done in a Jupyter notebook that explains why we're doing what we're doing. And we published that under first.org. So I hope many of you know who first.org is. If you don't, find out. Wonderful organization. Is where BB and I were hanging out in Japan. It's a week of incident responders giving each other lessons and sharing stories and building trust. And I love that it's particularly international. So this GitHub repo is available. You can go and download the code, and I've put in notes to explain why I'm doing some of the things I'm doing. You might find a model that's even better and works better, and I hope that you do. But the point is that some of this stuff needs to be open source, even if people do have proprietary solutions for some of it as well. I'm coming to the end so we can take some questions. Basic idea, hopefully I've convinced you that we're getting more predictive, more scientific, we have a good theory, and I hope that we've also convinced you that we have a theory of change. How does our industry change? How does vulnerability management change? Is, I think, an important part of the dialogue. So spread the ideas for me, commit some code to the GitHub repo if you want, improve the usability. We have a mailing list at First where you can talk about these topics. We have a conference if you want to come and present at the conference. There's the GitHub. You can talk to me a little bit today or talk to Lorenzo and Bibi because I'll have to take off for the conference immediately after this. But at least for the next 15 minutes, I'll take some questions.
All right, let's give an applause to the speaker. Now, regarding the questions, there are at least a few ways you can ask the questions. First of all, if you're here, raise a hand. We'll give you a microphone, so it's a priority if you're here on site versus being remote. If you're remote or you're a very shy one, please use the Menti and Menti code that's showed on the screen and ask that there. And the other way is just grab Éireann after, or any of our speakers after the talk and just ask. Because the priority is for the ones who are here. Are there any questions from the audience? All right, while everyone's thinking about a question, so now you're talking about the prediction and you're focusing mainly on the defender side, whether I should patch or not. Maybe you touched upon it a little bit, but does this vulnerability prediction also allows the software developer to kind of focus their software development lifecycle and focus more on a particular kind of vulnerability that they need to kind of have in their software development lifecycle to look for?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and it reminds me of something that I maybe forgot to tell you. There's a lot going on in this space, but there are people who predict the number of vulnerabilities from GitHub or from any code base. They pull the code from the code base and they say, this is how many vulnerabilities we think you have with this project. And it has to be a sufficiently large project. And I think a lot of the code analysis tools out there are doing similar sort of work and getting predictive. I chose to do this based on NVD rather than knowledge of the code. And you have some interesting problems of code coverage if you do it that way. But basically, that's also a science that is emerging, taking an existing code base and telling you what kinds of vulnerabilities you're likely to see, what kinds of vulnerabilities you should be training your developers on because they're turning up so often in the code base. So yeah, that is also cool research. And there's a couple, there was a guy called Carlos Buda, I think, at our first conference who was doing that kind of work, and other academics doing that kind of work too. It's very cool.
So in your work here are, if I understood it correctly, I hope I understood it correctly, so you are doing prediction based on the CVSS string and then trying to see which CVSS strings potentially can be abused in a future, right? Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's worth setting these questions up with this. Whenever you're doing predictive work or statistics work, you need a thing called a reference class, right? And the reference class, for me, is the NVD database.
Correct.
For these other people, it's like the code base, or it's like an Nmap, series of Nmap scans over time, or things like this. So depending on your starting reference class, you'll get kind of different answers.
Right, we'll come down to CVSS as well.
Sure.
Now, NVD also has the CWE, the weakness enumeration, right? Mm-hmm. Do you do forecasting based on the CWE? It would be nice, I mean, OWASP top 10, right? Mm-hmm. They are not very frequent, but they do update it once in a while. It would be nice that every morning I just see what potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses I might encounter today, right? Mm-hmm. Is that something that you could help out?
I'm pushing in that direction, as you saw from the research. But the reason it's not easy is because you have to check whether each of these component parts are a dependent variable of a previous forecast. So you have to, what I'm getting at is you have to forecast them in the right order and then build a hierarchical forecast out of them. So for example, I know that CVSS is a dependent variable of the CNA. Different CVE numbering authorities come out with different distribution of CVSS scores. And different vendors come out with a different distribution of CVSS scores, which is interesting in and of itself. It sort of tells you it's not objective. But my point being, you need to know what your vendor is before you predict what your CVSS score is, because the one is related to the other.
Let's see if there are any questions. Yes, there is a question in the room.
Good.
Patching costs money typically, like operational costs should or could those vulnerability predictions be used when choosing technology stack for the solutions?
Brilliant question. And that's exactly where the Airbus research kind of went. I'll be honest, it was born out of OT. You and I share a love of OT, and I don't do much industrial control system stuff anymore, but back in sort of 2010 on to 2020, I still did a bit more of it. And I was inspired by predictive maintenance. So essentially, Airbus built helicopters, amongst many other things. And these helicopters would come in every 6 months for maintenance, and they were running AIX. And so they would say, like, oh, we're going to do maintenance on these helicopters for like 3 days every 6 months. Could you tell us how many AIX patches we expect to have in that time period? Because we might as well patch the operating systems while we're like rebuilding the helicopter and doing predictive maintenance. And so I was really inspired by that. And that goes back to your point about value and how long it takes you to patch things and what is the cost of taking a helicopter out of service and then putting it back in service. And so I can't necessarily tell you the value to your organization of that, but if you tell me that, I can roll that into a deeper analysis of what vendors you might choose based on the number of vulnerabilities and the number of patches you might have to install. We have to be a little careful in the sense that 5 or 6 vulnerabilities might be fixed in a single patch, and that has to be kind of bespoke research based on the vendor. But basically, yes, you can go in that direction. So my goal is to make these so useful for you that you could then do that work by adding in the value to your organization.
Now, I think you already touched upon this, that everything is based on the input data, right? And you said if you trust the CNA, if you trust the vendor who is kind of pushing the CVSS. Now, in general, when I look at the CVSS, it's ambiguous, and it mostly depends on the one who has submitted the CVS string. Is the researcher and his view on the particular vulnerability. And we've heard there are review programs that will review, and typically they will downgrade. In not most of the cases, but in majority of the cases, it will be downgraded the value, right? So when we're dealing with a prediction, are you taking into account that this fuzziness about or inconclusiveness about the CVSS strings?
Not really, in the sense that I'm not going to look at the history of any individual vulnerability and how it's had change. But it all shakes out roughly the same way, in that the proportions, like if you look at the proportion of CVSS vector strings or numbers over time, these lines are like perfectly in proportion to the number of vulnerabilities. They're very stable. It's not like CVSS2 was 2% of vulnerabilities one year and was 20% the next year. It's a very stable percentage. And I think that's because even though you might argue about an individual CVSS vector string, people look at some of them more than others, right? And also, some of them are impossible in certain technologies. Like, if it's not a network device, it's always going to be a local CVSS vector string. So there's a relationship between that, as well as not just technology, but programming language, right? Like, if it's C, you might have some memory corruption, and if it's OCaml, you shouldn't, at least in theory.
What do you think if the exploit development or the market for cyber weapons or exploits, I mean, there are even price lists, how much the remote code execution on the Windows would cost, or iPhone unlock. Is that market also impacting where everyone is going to look, the security researchers, and that's pretty much what drives that, right?
And ironically, I think it's just going to make it more predictable, right? So like, it's not going to make my job harder, it's going to make my job easier as a forecaster and a predictor of these things, because we know how much money and time and effort it takes to find certain things. And maybe some of this research could also be used by bug bounty programs to reprioritize what you're hunting for. Like, you could either go against the grain of what I'm seeing and say, I want to incentivize something different, or you could go, all right, this is where things happen to be, let's keep going in that direction. And I refer to that as like vulnerability or exploit fashion. Like, I know it's a bit glib, but I think exploitation is the cutting edge of fashion. Like, zero-day creators like get really obsessed with a certain idea and want to find certain kinds of vulnerability, and they set the tone for all the juniors.
Now, I will ask with this question from our Mentimeter, but I will paraphrase it. Now, is there anything that we can do as a security community to minimize the vulnerabilities that exist? Like, for example, the question here is, can we use Linux instead of Windows? Mm-hmm. Would that kind of impact that, or you would say, no way?
It's a good question, but there's like a load of ideology and dynamism into that question, right? So I'll start with the dynamism. I think people find more vulnerabilities in Windows because it's more popular. And people didn't find many vulnerabilities in Mac, and then it became popular, and now they find vulnerabilities in Mac. And if Linux was the most popular operating system on the internet, guess what? It is. People would also be finding a lot of vulnerabilities in there. And then the diversity of the Linux community and where you report your vulnerabilities to makes it kind of a complicated space. But I study them as a CNA, and they produce a certain number of vulnerabilities. I think the point I want to make is it's dangerous to assume that the rate of vulnerabilities is reflective of the number of vulnerabilities that exist. So if you want me to be really blunt, I'm forecasting the extraction rate of vulnerabilities. I'm not telling you how secure any software is, because I don't know. There could be more vulnerabilities that aren't, discovered in Linux than there were in Windows. But choosing your operating system because it's inexpensive to patch and does in-memory patching might be a very, very good idea, right?
Let's take if there's one more question from the audience. If not, I will conclude the session, and I will give you so to explain what's inside, I will give you the gift for our speakers, which is truffles made in Latvia, so chocolate, with socks, and I predict socks are 80% cotton and 15% polyamide. I hope you will enjoy them.
I will.
All right,
I probably won't enjoy them in the same moment. I like to keep the socks and the chocolate separate, but yeah.
With this, we will conclude the session and give applause to Éireann.
Thank you for having me. Cool. Hope I delivered.